The chatter of voices and the rhythmic tap of rolling luggage echoed through the arrivals terminal at JFK International Airport. Passengers from every corner of the world navigated the bustling space, some eager to reunite with loved ones, others simply grateful to stretch their legs after long, exhausting flights. Among them was Miguel Santos, his steps measured as he adjusted the strap of his leather carry-on bag. Despite the weariness of a 6-hour flight from Manila tugging at his body, he held himself with the kind of poise that had become second nature. His navy blue suit was as crisp as when he first donned it, and his polished dress shoes gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a clear testament to his status. Miguel had made this journey more times than he could count, and yet each trip carried with it the same unshakable reality. Perception often overshadowed the truth. Despite being the CEO of a successful tech firm, Miguel had learned that to many, his accomplishments meant little in comparison to the stereotypes that clung to him. His Filipino heritage, his accent, and even his demeanor had become things others used to make assumptions about who he was. The skepticism was sometimes subtle, sometimes glaring, but it never failed to remind him that reality was often irrelevant in the eyes of others. But Miguel had learned to maintain grace in the face of ignorance. As he approached the immigration checkpoint, he handed his passport to the officer without a word. The officer barely glanced at him before stamping the document and dismissively gesturing him forward. That part was always easy. But as he moved toward customs, Miguel could sense a shift. When he retrieved his black rolling suitcase from the carousel, a presence stopped him. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer near a group of customs agents was staring directly at him. His arms were crossed, his gaze unwavering, as though trying to see through Miguel, trying to size him up. Miguel felt it, that familiar weight of scrutiny, a judgment he knew all too well. The officer's badge read, Bradley. Miguel sighed inwardly. Here we go again. Bradley exchanged a few hushed words with his colleagues before stepping forward, his boots heavy on the polished floor as he closed the distance between them. You, he barked, jerking his chin in Miguel's direction. Step over here. Miguel raised an eyebrow but complied, rolling his suitcase toward the inspection area. Is there a problem, officer? He asked, keeping his voice steady. Bradley didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate look at Miguel, as if scrutinizing every detail. Then, with a tone laced with suspicion, he grunted, We'll see. Open your bag. Miguel's heart began to pound, but he refused to let his frustration show. He unzipped his suitcase, revealing neatly folded clothes, a toiletry kit, and a leather notebook filled with business documents. Bradley wasted no time rifling through Miguel's belongings, tossing shirts aside, shaking out pouches, and flipping through the pages of the notebook with unnecessary force. Miguel tried to maintain his calm. If you're looking for something specific, I can help, he said in a neutral tone. Bradley picked up a bottle of cologne and turned it over in his hands, as though it were some kind of illicit substance. What's this? He asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Miguel blinked in confusion. Cologne. A gift. Bradley scoffed and shoved it back into the bag with unnecessary force. He took a second look at Miguel's passport, his eyes narrowing. You travel a lot, he muttered, almost to himself. Miguel nodded, his patience growing thin. Yes, my company works with international clients. Bradley's lips curled into a small, disbelieving smirk. Oh yeah? What kind of business are we talking about? Miguel swallowed back the bite of annoyance threatening to escape. Software development. My company specializes in cybersecurity and AI integration. Bradley chuckled derisively. Is that so? His tone oozed disbelief. Miguel met his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched between them, suffocating, while other passengers passed by, hardly noticing the standoff taking place. They were moving quickly, breezing through with barely a second glance, while Miguel, he knew why, was being delayed. And as the seconds ticked by, he felt the weight of the officer's assumptions pressing down on him. Finally, Bradley let out a mock sigh. Step aside, he said curtly. "We need to run some checks." Miguel's jaw clenched, but he said nothing as he moved to the side, watching Bradley and another officer whispering at a computer terminal. The moment dragged on, his body stiff with tension. His mind was already on the meeting he had in just a few hours, time he couldn't afford to waste. After what felt like an eternity, Bradley returned. He looked at Miguel with an exaggerated eye roll. "Looks like you're clear," he said, his voice dripping with a strange satisfaction. Miguel moved toward his suitcase, but before he could reach it, Bradley stepped into his path. "One more thing," he said, his voice lowering. Miguel froze. Something was off. "You people think you can just walk in here like you own the place," Bradley sneered, his eyes cold with contempt. Miguel's blood ran cold. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it that made the words even more dangerous. "Excuse me?" he asked, keeping his gaze fixed on Bradley. "You heard me," Bradley said with a smirk, leaning in as if he had all the power. Miguel exhaled slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "I've been more than cooperative, officer. If we're finished here, I'll be on my way." Bradley's smirk faltered, replaced by a tight jaw. "You don't get to tell me when we're finished," he spat, his tone now dangerously low. In a sudden, aggressive movement, Bradley shoved Miguel hard. The impact sent Miguel stumbling backward, his shoulders slamming into the wall, his suitcase careening to the floor. The force of the shove was deliberate, meant to provoke, and it worked. Miguel's blood boiled as his body regained balance, but the anger was still bubbling beneath the surface, now undeniable. Miguel's suitcase had toppled over, and a few passengers nearby gasped in shock. One man quickly pulled out his phone, capturing the scene as it unfolded. Miguel took a deep breath and slowly straightened himself, his expression calm. But inside, everything had shifted. Officer Bradley had made an immense mistake, one that would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't even imagine. Before Miguel could fully process the intensity of what had just happened, Bradley stepped forward, his smug expression growing as he loomed over him. "Resisting, huh?" Bradley sneered, cracking his knuckles as though to emphasize his power. "That's an offense." Miguel stood tall, straightening his suit jacket, smoothing out the creases where Bradley had shoved him. His muscles were tense, but his face remained unreadable. Years spent in boardrooms negotiating multi-million-dollar deals had taught him how to deal with men who thrived on intimidation. He spoke in a steady, controlled voice. "I did not resist, officer, and I suggest you think carefully about what you do next." Bradley let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, is that right? You're suggesting I'm doing something wrong?" he scoffed. Miguel held his gaze unwavering. "I'm stating a fact." The crowd around them had begun to grow, travelers pausing to watch the escalating confrontation. Some discreetly raised their phones, recording the incident, while others whispered amongst themselves, their eyes flicking nervously between Miguel and Bradley. But Bradley, drunk on his sense of authority, didn't seem to notice. "You think you're important, huh?" he sneered, stepping even closer, his eyes filled with disdain. "Walking in here in your fancy suit, talking down to people like me." Miguel's jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of man before, someone who saw authority as an excuse to exert control. Now, with his power challenged in front of a crowd, Bradley was desperate to put Miguel in his place. Miguel wasn't intimidated. "Turn around," Bradley snapped, his voice low and demanding. "Hands behind your back." Miguel didn't move. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. Bradley's smirk deepened, as if he thought he could break Miguel's resolve. "Oh, we'll figure that out at the station," he said with a sneer. That was it, the final confirmation that this wasn't about protocol or procedure. This was all about Bradley's ego and prejudice. Miguel exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "I strongly advise against this," he said, his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. For a brief moment, Bradley's smirk faltered, as if he sensed that things were about to spiral out of control, but then he doubled down, his arrogance returning in full force. "You don't get to advise me, boy," he spat, grabbing Miguel's arm roughly. The gasps from the onlookers were immediate, and more phones appeared, recording the entire interaction. The energy in the air shifted, now charged with a dangerous intensity. Miguel could feel Bradley's fingers digging into the sleeve of his expensive suit, but he didn't give in to the pressure. Just as Bradley reached for his handcuffs, a sharp, authoritative voice sliced through the commotion. "Officer Bradley, stand down! Now!" The words hit the air like a thunderclap, and Bradley froze. His grip loosened, and for the first time his bravado cracked. Slowly he turned toward the voice, his jaw tight with the realization that he was no longer in control. The crowd parted slightly to reveal a tall man in a dark navy suit, walking toward them with purpose. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the airport floor, his movements measured, confident. A gold badge gleamed on his hip, the unmistakable insignia of Homeland Security. Two high-ranking airport security officials flanked him, their expressions unreadable. The Homeland Security agent stopped in front of Bradley, his gaze cold and unyielding. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Bradley stiffened, his bravado slipping away entirely. "Sir, this man was acting suspiciously. I know exactly what you were doing." The agent cut him off, his eyes flicking briefly to Miguel, then to the crowd of onlookers, and finally to the phones now recording the entire encounter. "And you just made a very, very serious mistake." Miguel adjusted his suit jacket, his composure fully intact, as he stood in the center of the storm. He knew what was coming. Bradley's realization hit him hard, and the agent's words were the final confirmation of his error. This wasn't just any passenger that Bradley had tried to intimidate. This was Miguel Santos, CEO of C Innovations, one of Southeast Asia's largest cybersecurity firms, with close ties to numerous U.S. government agencies. And now, Bradley was about to face the consequences of his actions. By the time the sun had barely begun to set over New York, the first video clips of the incident had gone viral. Passengers who had witnessed the confrontation uploaded the footage to social media, and it spread like wildfire. Headlines read, "Racist cop abuses power, instantly regrets it. Filipino CEO humiliates racist officer at JFK. Justice served. Officer learns a hard lesson after wrongfully detaining man." Hashtags like "Our Justice for Miguel," "Our Racial Profiling Exposed," and "All Hold Them Accountable" began trending within hours. Millions of views, thousands of comments, and an overwhelming outcry filled the online space. The video had struck a nerve, and the anger was palpable. Miguel, however, wasn't content to let this become just another viral moment. The very next morning, he filed a formal complaint against Officer Bradley, addressing both the Department of Homeland Security and the Port Authority Police. Backed by his legal team and the resources of his company, Miguel ensured the complaint wouldn't get buried in bureaucracy. News outlets jumped on the story, and major media stations ran segments with the footage playing in the background. Analysts called it a textbook case of racial profiling and abuse of power. Even civil rights organizations issued statements condemning Bradley's actions and demanding accountability. This wasn't just about one man's arrogance. This was about something much larger, and Miguel intended to make sure Bradley understood the full weight of his mistake. With the pressure of public outrage mounting, an internal investigation into Officer Bradley's actions was launched just 24 hours after the incident. The results were swift and damning. Officer Bradley was officially suspended, but that was just the beginning. As the investigation delved deeper, more disturbing allegations came to light. Cases of excessive force, racial bias, and misconduct that had been quietly swept under the rug for years began to surface. Now, with the public watching and demanding action, the department had no choice but to act. 1 week later, Officer Bradley's career came to a definitive end. The airport authority issued a press release stating, "Following a thorough investigation, Officer Bradley has been dismissed from his position due to violations of conduct, misuse of authority, and inappropriate behavior toward passengers." His badge, pension, and career were all gone. His arrogance had cost him everything, and now he was left with nothing. 2 weeks after the incident, Miguel returned to JFK International Airport, this time preparing to fly back to the Philippines. But things were different now. As he walked through security, he wasn't alone. A team of high-ranking airport officials and Homeland Security representatives were by his side, escorting him personally to ensure that his departure was smooth and dignified. Some airport employees recognized him and whispered among themselves. A few even approached him to offer apologies for what had happened. Miguel accepted their gestures with grace, understanding that this moment was bigger than him. This wasn't just about his personal experience anymore. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated, disrespected, or judged unfairly because of their race or background. Today, Miguel had shown that arrogance and racism would not prevail. He had stood firm in the face of injustice and proven that, in the end, integrity and courage win. As Miguel's flight soared above the skyline of New York, he took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure wash over him. It wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about the system that had allowed people like Bradley to exist unchecked, believing they were above accountability. But change, Miguel knew, happens when people refuse to stay silent. Miguel had spoken up, and the world had listened. Justice had been served. He believed in accountability, in fairness, and in the ongoing fight against discrimination. And as the story spread, more and more people shared it, because some battles need to be fought not just for the present, but for the future.